Hello everyone! You probably know what I'm about to say. We're doing something different today. This is not a review, and it's not... I wouldn't call it a video essay either. I just happened to notice something while watching a movie earlier this month, and I realized that was a running characteristic rather than a one-time occurrence. The more I considered it, the more interested I was in exploring the idea further. That turned into a fun little project, and then after having spent quite a bit of time thinking about it, I said, hey, I could make a video on this, and I thought you might be interested in hearing my observations. So here you go. Much has been said and written over the years about the films Val Lewton produced for RKO in the mid-1940s. Their style, their themes, their stories. Attention has even been given before to their use of sound. I'm not reinventing the wheel here, but from what I've found, the discussion tends to focus on how sound is used in the first film. And I would like to broaden the topic to consider how sound enhances all 9 films. Or at least most of them. Born in Yalta as Vladimir Ivanovich Hofschneider, Val Lewton was a writer who got into the movie-making business in the early 30s. He worked under producer David O. Selznick, making his most notable contributions during that time to scenes in 1935's A Tale of Two Cities and 1939's Gone with the Wind. Through the 30s into the 40s, Universal Studios had been dominating the horror movie market with their Dracula, Frankenstein, Mummy, Invisible Man, and Wolfman films and their subsequent sequels, all of which I have reviewed in years past. As Universal's monster series started to become more bombastic, RKO decided to jump into the fray, but with the intention of making movies very different from what Universal was putting out. In 1942, Val Lewton was named head of the horror department at RKO. He was given 3 stipulations. The films he produced had to have budgets under $150,000, had to be under 75 minutes long, and had to use whatever titles were supplied by studio executives. Val Lewton did produce a few films that were not horror-related during this period, but generally, when someone talks about Val Lewton films, they are referring to the 9 films in the horror, mystery, thriller genre that he produced for RKO in a span of just 4 years. Cat People from 1942, I Walked with a Zombie from 1943, The Leopard Man from 1943, The Seventh Victim from 1943, The Ghost Ship from 1943, The Curse of the Cat People from 1944, The Body Snatcher from 1945, Isle of the Dead from 1945, and Bedlam from 1946. How much influence a producer has on the films he produces varies. Like David O. Selznick, Val Lewton was a hands-on man, heavily involved in every part of the process. From the RKO talent pool, he handpicked writers, directors, etc. that he had previously worked with, and chose workmen with experience on high-quality projects. Many of them had worked with Orson Welles on Citizen Kane and The Magnificent Ambersons. Lewton himself chose source material, changed story settings, cast actors, made suggestions for music scores, and gave instructions regarding how certain scenes were to be lit and filmed, especially in ways that would elevate the mood while keeping a film under budget. And though he took partial credit for writing on just 2 films, The Body Snatcher and Bedlam, using the pseudonym Carlos Keith, in reality, his fingerprints covered the detailed final drafts of all 9 scripts. What elements typify a Val Lewton film? Atmosphere, shadows, stark contrasts of light and dark, known as chiaroscuro, hints of otherworldliness, suggestions of madness, bitter rivalries, morally gray characters, manipulation, loss of innocence, the clash of science and emotion when confronted with the reality and danger of the occult, paranoia, isolation, predator versus prey, a hunted character taking a long walk at night, increasingly aware of someone or something hidden in the darkness just beyond. It's during such noticeably quiet scenes that the viewer becomes sensitive to every little sound. As a result, the reaction to whatever follows, be it a sudden noise or a sudden silence, is that much more intense. Note that I'm talking about sound as opposed to music. These films do have noteworthy scores, all of them composed by Roy Webb with the exception of Isle of the Dead, but in the moments I'm referring to, stalking sequences, pivotal events, scenes where terror is at its peak, there is no music. And in the eerie silence and heightened tension, any sound effects that are there are magnified. The most famous example of prominent sound design occurs in the very first Val Lewton film, 1942's Cat People, directed by Jacques Tourneur and starring Simone, Kent Smith, Tom Conway, and Jane Randolph. A newlywed bride, influenced by the ancient legends of her Serbian village, fears that intimacy with her husband will turn her into a murderous cat. Handled differently, Cat People could have been something with literal cat-human hybrids, perhaps. But Lewton and Tourneur, plus editor Mark Robson and writer DeWitt Bodine, worked together to create a tasteful, psychological horror film, one which became an unexpected success for RKO. When people mention sound in Val Lewton films, their go-to reference is what's known as the Lewton bus, an effect that punctuates the stalking scene in Cat People. Jane Randolph's character walks down the sidewalk, unaware she's being followed. The two pairs of heels striking the pavement is the only sound on the street. It's when the clacking of the other footsteps ceases that she becomes alert, pausing under a streetlight to glance back. There was someone behind her. Where did that someone go? Now the audience's apprehension caused by the presence of a sound turns into fear at its sudden absence. Randolph quickens her pace, anxiously looking backward as she hurries through the dark to the next light, and then the next. Leaning against the post, she looks behind and all around as we hear a sound we've heard previously in the film, a low, cat-like growl. That's the Lewton bus. For a split second, the character and the viewer are tricked into thinking a panther is attacking, but it's only the bus's air brakes. This effect was not Lewton's contribution, but Mark Robson's, an intentional ploy to startle the audience at the height of the scene with a loud noise uncannily similar to the more sinister sound we were bracing for, accompanied by an abrupt cut and a swift entrance from the opposite side of the frame. The effect was dubbed the Lewton bus, or the cat scare, and it's more familiar to audiences now as the jump scare. Unfortunately, a lot of jump scares nowadays feel like lazy attempts to manipulate the audience. Thanks to overuse, a lot of them are predictable and annoying. But if used sparingly and creatively, they can still be effective. The other famous stalking scene in Cat People takes place at a swimming pool. There's a persistent sound of water dripping in the background as Randolph peers toward the stairs, the only source of light. Hearing the cat's growl and seeing a suspicious shadow, she dives into the pool. But is it the safest place, or is she now being circled by an invisible predator? The water keeps on dripping, and then the scene crescendos as a shadow dances on the wall. The cat lets out a scream, and so does the woman. The marriage of sound and editing makes it a terrifying scene. Incredibly simple, but wonderfully effective. Credited as sound recordist on Cat People is John L. Cass. I couldn't find much information about him, unfortunately, but he worked in the sound department on a lot of movies from 1933 to his death in 1952. One of those movies was the screwball comedy Bringing Up Baby, which features a leopard on the loose, so that seems appropriate. The rest of the Lewton films list different people for sound recordist, but for sound re-recordist, there are two recurring names, James G. Stewart and Terry Kellum. Stewart worked as re-recordist on 6 films, Kellum worked on the other 2. Terry Kellum was a sound technician with a ton of credits, 221 over the course of his career, but other than that, I couldn't find out much about him. With James G. Stewart, however, I had better luck. On Wikipedia, Stewart is described as, quote, a pioneer in the field of sound recording and re-recording. He used his expertise in radio to help motion pictures make the transition to sound, and was RKO's chief re-recording mixer from 1933 to 1945. He often went uncredited for his work, not really that unusual. There were a lot of people who went uncredited for their work on movies back then, but he did earn 4 Academy Award nominations in the special effects category, which at that time combined visual and audible effects, winning for 1948's Portrait of Jenny. Like others on Lewton's team, he had worked closely with Orson Welles, who also had a background in radio, innovating the process of recording sound in both production and post-production. Stewart also developed a bunch of other things that I really have no knowledge about because, well, despite the fact that I'm making this video, which is all about sound and sound effects, sound is not something I know a whole lot about. He came up with a mixing console for re-recording, an early version of surround sound, and electronic compression, which later came to be known as dynamic range compression, which has to do with reducing the volume of loud sounds or amplifying quiet sounds. And that's something that's done a lot with great effect in Lewton's films. This was so exciting to research. When I found out about Stewart's connection to Citizen Kane and that he was an inventor of all these techniques, I was like, it all makes so much sense now. No wonder these movies have such distinct sound. The next 2 films are ones I associate with one particular sound. 1943's I Walked with a Zombie was directed by Jacques Tourneur, starring Francis D., Tom Conway, James Ellison, and Edith Barrett. A nurse takes a job on the West Indian island of St. Sebastian, caring for the wife of a sugar plantation owner. Though she falls in love with her employer, she decides she must try to restore his wife to him, even if that means bringing her patient to a voodoo ritual. The auditory feature I associate with this film is the sound of drums beating in the distance.
The jungle drums, mysterious, eerie.
These drum rhythms add to the atmosphere, and they are relevant to the setting, the culture, and the plot, increasing in significance as the narrative unfolds. Notice, too, this extra little touch. The way the curtain's movement seems to brush the harp strings and play them. That opens a sequence where the dominant sound is that of a character's feet shuffling as he approaches, his long shadow cast on the wall and on the ground. And the most famous sequence of the film, in which the nurse and her patient walk through a sugarcane field maze, is both visually impressive and enhanced with strange sounds, the relentless howling of the wind and the crunch of the dry cane as they pass. For the record, I still don't see I Walked with a Zombie as a Jane Eyre retelling. I know that boggles some people's minds, but while I acknowledge there are elements in common, It's just not the same story or characters for me, so I don't consider it an adaptation. Lewton, I know, would disagree. He was the one who overhauled Kurt Siodmak's screenplay and chose to model the revision after the Charlotte Bronte novel. The similarities were intentional. By the way, I Walked with a Zombie came out in April 1943. 20th Century Fox's adaptation starring Joan Fontaine and Orson Welles premiered in the UK that December, with a wide US release delayed until the following April. Just a little Jane Eyre trivia for ya. 1943's The Leopard Man was the third and last Lewton film Jacques Tourneur directed, and it stars Dennis O'Keefe, Margot, Jean Brooks, Isabel Jewell, and James Bell. When a tame leopard breaks loose and kills a girl, panic spreads among the inhabitants of a small New Mexican town who fear they might be next. What I associate with this film is the unique sound of castanets. The clicking and clacking, or whatever you want to call it, of castanets comes and goes throughout the entire film. I saw this several years ago and really liked it, and every time I've thought of it since, I thought first of castanets. The second thing I always remember is the image of blood seeping under the door and pooling in the groove, a haunting sight preceded by the sound of a helpless victim's terrified screams.
Mama Seeger, let me in! Let me in! Let me in! He's coming! He's coming closer! I can see it!
Just what she needs, someone to nip at her heels and hurry her up.
The Leopard Man has some appropriately quiet stalking scenes of its own. These are the sections where the tension ramps up, these long periods where a solitary, vulnerable figure listens keenly to every little sound and peers into the blackness to try to discern some shape. The film would probably not have been nearly as interesting without these sound effects, and without the attention given to making these sequences as frightening and as suggestive as they could be. 1943's The Seventh Victim marks the directorial debut for Mark Robson, who had worked as editor on the last 3 films. It stars Kim Hunter, Tom Conway, Jean Brooks, and Isabel Jewell. A young woman goes looking for her missing sister and gets tangled up with a devil-worshipping cult. I admit I don't have as much to say about this one. I've seen it in parts, but that was a while ago, and I didn't get a chance to revisit more than a few scenes before filming this video. I don't mind that. As I recall, I found it disjointed, and I just wasn't that into it. A lot of that has to do with the subject matter. As many of you know, I typically stay away from movies that involve devil worship and demons and seances, etc. Besides, on the off chance that someone comes across this video and says, "Hey, she did all this work, awesome, I'm gonna steal her research and her observations and put it in my term paper and pass it off as my own," I'm purposely leaving some gaps. Yes, there are people who do that. I can tell you that The Seventh Victim has a stalking sequence. It's different from the others, though, in that it is accompanied by music, which is doing a lot to drive the mood, except when it backs off to allow certain sounds to be isolated. The flick of a switchblade, for instance. There is also another classic Lewton bus moment. 1943's The Ghost Ship was directed by Mark Robson and stars Richard Dix, Russell Wade, and Edith Barrett. A naval officer enthusiastically sets off on his first long voyage, but soon begins to suspect that his captain is insane. It was while watching The Ghost Ship early this month that I became aware of just how good the sound in these movies is all across the board. I was familiar with all the Lewton films before, to one degree or another, except this one. It turns out it was withdrawn from circulation after Lewton lost a plagiarism lawsuit from two aspiring writers who had previously submitted a screenplay, which Lewton claimed he hadn't looked at. The ghost ship remained unseen until the copyright lapsed and it entered public domain in the 90s. I'm not reviewing movies here, so you'll have to tune into What Else I Saw in October next week to find out what I thought of it, but it's a quality film. As for how it sounds, there's a scene where a large hook begins swinging out of control in the night. As it passes to and fro on the deck of the ship and men try to get hold of it without getting hooked in the gut, it makes ominous creaks and groans and clanking noises. The simplicity of the scene, where you hear nothing but the sounds of the hook swinging, the sea breeze, and the men's shouts, adds a sense of realism. I love a good score as much as anyone, maybe more than some people, but sometimes no music is better. Later, in what I consider the best scene, a sailor is below in a chain locker, rearranging the links as men up top direct the heavy chain downward. The sailor goes to tell the men to take it easy, only to find he's locked inside, and they can't hear him over the noise. The rattling of the chain gets louder and increases in pitch, paralleling the mounting panic on his face, while the men above are completely unaware. While the ghost ship doesn't have a stalking scene per se, it does have a scene where sinister footsteps approach a cabin with evil intent, and a scene where a line of dialogue is overheard, and the eavesdropper obsesses over it in his head, the voices echoing and even twisting the words.
If the boy is right, if the boy is right, if the boy is right, the boy is right, the boy is right, the boy is right.
Something similar to this would be done a couple of years later in The Body Snatcher. 1944's The Curse of the Cat People was originally directed by Gunter von Fritsch, but when he fell behind schedule, he was replaced by Robert Wise, making his official debut as director. This film is a sequel to Cat People in that it has the same cast in the same roles, Simone, Kent Smith, Jane Randolph, but it focuses on young Amy, played by child actress Ann Carter, a lonely little girl whose new imaginary friend is actually the ghost of her father's dead first wife. Outside of some of the characters, this story is not really related to Cat People, and RKO was guilty of some shockingly misleading advertising. The reference in the title was an executive cash grab to play off the success of the 42 film. Lewton had wanted to title it just Amy and Her Friend. Regrettably, I didn't get to go over this film again either. I have seen it though, and it's noticeably different from all the other films in this group. It's a fantasy, but it's not a horror film, and while there are atmospheric moments, these aren't really intended to be startling. When it comes to what you hear, I think it's more about music than individual sound effects, which in itself is interesting, particularly the Christmas scene where two separate songs are being sung simultaneously and overlap. But that's not really the kind of thing I'm focusing on here. 1945's The Body Snatcher was also directed by Robert Wise and stars Boris Karloff, Henry Daniell, Russell Wade, Bela Lugosi, and Edith Atwater. It's set in 19th century Scotland, where a young medical student is dismayed to learn the disturbing source of his teacher's test subjects. This film was based on a Robert Louis Stevenson story, itself inspired by the real-life scandal of Burke and Hare. For the first time, Lewton, under the name Carlos Keith, took partial credit for the screenplay, sharing it with Philip MacDonald. This also marks the first of 3 times Lewton would work with Boris Karloff, who he'd avoided before, associating him with the Frankenstein films, which he didn't like. But when he learned that Karloff was also unhappy about the typecasting that hampered his career, he changed his mind. Aside from being an excellent, albeit unsettling, film that boasts the final appearance of Karloff and Lugosi on screen together, The Body Snatcher makes clever use of sound. The distinct clip-clop of horse hooves is established early on as the harbinger of Karloff's deceptively friendly cabbie Gray. He crosses one shot, passing the protagonist's path long before they meet. Several times more we hear that clip-clop, usually when Gray's presence is about to darken the picture. A contrasting motif is the sweet sound of a street singer played by Donna Lee, who performs Scottish folk songs all day and all night. In a chilling scene, we watch, or rather listen, as the two sounds, representative of the two characters, collide.
Silk and cotton doll.
Breaking the ominous silence is, once again, the horse's hooves on cobblestones, announcing the cabbie's return with his quarry. They made an interesting choice shortly after that. As the doctor and the student argue over the murder, we hear a brief, subtle ghost of the singer's voice.
I can't believe that. Believe it or not, it's best that you pretend that you do. After all, you ordered this subject, received it here and paid for it.
And as the film reaches a stunning climax, Gray's voice begins to nag the doctor, first calling him by his nickname. And then taunting him with words previously spoken, "You'll never get rid of me," now repeating in a malicious loop that mimics the horse's thunderous gallop.
Never get rid of me, 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 never get rid of me.
1945's Isle of the Dead was directed by Mark Robson and stars Boris Karloff, Ellen Drew, Mark Kramer, and Catherine Emery. The title was inspired by a painting of the same name by Arnold Böcklin. Members of a small group quarantined by an outbreak of plague in the house begin to fear there's a legendary vampiric creature among them. This is a film I'd seen, I think, the beginning of before, but I hadn't found it that interesting, so I didn't stick with it. I guess it just wasn't the right time, because it's actually got great stuff. A small group stuck together on an island, growing paranoia, fear of premature burial, a fanciful setting, and great sound effects. The two men are initially drawn to the house where they'll find themselves trapped by mysterious singing. And then there's the premature burial thing. 3 times we cut away from the house to the echoey tomb, zooming in on the coffin as a drop of water drips and drips and drips. Then whoever's inside that coffin wakes. They're essentially doing the same thing they did in Cat People, using amplified sounds, the water dripping and the scratching of fingernails on wood, which gives me goosebumps, and then, to really creep you out, a sudden, jarring shriek. Then there is a sequence where one character is being followed by another, whose strange, tuneless humming is being carried along by the wind. And then the scene that follows, with the wind howling through the tomb, the darkness, the vague possibility of a shape, the strange editing, very bizarre choices with the editing there. The extreme close-up on the girl, and her hesitant whisper, and then her cry of fear, all of it gave me chills.
Who's there? Is that you, Oliver?
I'm trying not to say too much here in case you decide you want to check this movie or any of these movies out for yourself. I don't want to rob you of the opportunity to enjoy these scenes and enjoy these film surprises, so I'm not going into great detail on purpose. The last Val Lewton film, 1946's Bedlam, was directed by Mark Robson and starred Boris Karloff, Anna Lee, Billy House, and Richard Fraser. The title and subsequent storyline were inspired by a print by William Hogarth titled A Rake's Progress. A young actress decides to go against her benefactor's wishes by advocating for the reform of St. Mary of Bethlehem Asylum, but her plan backfires when she finds herself committed through the scheming of the sadistic head apothecary. Bedlam doesn't use sound quite so intensely as previous Lewton films. Watching it, I felt like it was used more dramatically and less to frighten the audience. Still, sound is emphasized as Nell Bowen hears the cacophony of the inmates before she sees them. Karloff's character likened the inmates to animals living in their own bestial world. On Nell's first night there, she sits bolt upright in the dark, listening to the cries, moans, and screams of the insane, and at that moment, they are animalistic. She comes to recognize the humanity in the asylum, but on that first night, she's too afraid, listening to what could almost be the wild cries of the jungle. The inmates also have a habit of echoing any name that's called out on the street below.
Nell Bowen!
It's not the same kind of example as others I've talked about, but the confusing babble has a similar unnerving effect on the viewer and the character, hearing a chorus of her name bounce all over the ward in such a way that she must question her own senses.
Nell Bowen!
Bedlam turned out to be the last film of this set. The head of RKO died in 1946, and the studio went through a reorganization. Lewton ended up working at other studios, but the films he made there are not ones associated with his name like these, and he died in 1951. The next time you watch a Val Lewton movie, or any scary movie, I hope you won't forget to pay attention to how it sounds. What you hear or don't hear can be just as important as what you see or don't see, and the sound department that worked on these films, as well as the producer, director, and editor, understood that. Without such attention to sound effects and sound recording and sound re-recording, I dare say these films, though their beautiful photography is enough to conjure a sense of mystery and horror, would not be as heavy with terror and dread, and thus would not be as effective or as memorable as they are. I hope you enjoyed this video. It was not something I'd contemplated doing until a couple weeks ago, and even as late as this Tuesday, I wasn't fully committed to the idea. But I've done it, and I hope you found it entertaining and informative. Please go ahead and share your thoughts in the comments below. I look forward to hearing your response, and I'll be back again next week to tell you what else I saw in October. Thanks for watching.